On the cold dawn of June 13th, 1944, just 1 week after American soldiers had stormed the sands of Normandy, a new sound drifted across the quiet homes of southern England, a sound that Londoners would come to know in their bones before they ever understood it with their minds. It was a jagged, mechanical buzzing, like a chainsaw tearing through the sky, and it meant that Hitler's newest promise of terror had arrived. They called it the V-1 flying bomb. The newspapers would later call it the buzz bomb. But for the people living beneath its shadow, it was simply fear with wings. Imagine being a mother walking her child to school, hearing that engine sputter overhead, praying that the sound continued because the terrible truth was this: when the buzzing stopped, the bomb was falling. In those first days, nothing in Britain seemed capable of stopping the V-1. It streaked across the Channel at more than 400 miles per hour, carrying nearly a ton of explosives, arriving over London just 15 minutes after launch. German engineers had run the numbers with frightening precision. They were confident, beyond confident, they were certain that almost no one could shoot it down. A British pilot would have to dive at maximum speed, close within a few hundred yards of the bomb, and fire perfectly placed shots, all without being consumed by the explosion that followed. Statistically, the odds were hopeless. That was what Dr. Robert Lusser believed when he designed it. That was what General Dornberger assured the German High Command. And for a brief time, those early weeks when the attack began, Londoners feared they were right. The first V-2 hit railways, homes, churches, and schools. They shattered windows 20 blocks away. They ignited fuel depots and tore down brick buildings as if they were made of paper. And while the physical destruction was terrible, it was the rhythm of terror, the drone, the silence, the explosion that broke the spirit of the city. The British anti-aircraft crews tried. God knows they tried. Night after night they loaded shells, calculated timing settings by hand, wiping sweat and rain from their eyes as radar operators shouted height and speed from their stations. These gunners stood at their posts knowing that one mistake, even half a second off, meant their shells would burst in empty air, while the V-1 continued unchallenged toward the heart of the capital. You can picture them, men barely past 20, some much older, all exhausted, all standing in the freezing wind, trusting their lives and their city's safety to the tiny, fragile clockwork timers inside those old fuses. Londoners saw their struggle. They heard the desperate bursts of flak in the night sky. They watched as only 1 in 10 bombs was stopped, then 1 in 20, then sometimes none at all. The German High Command celebrated. Berlin believed the tide was turning back their way. They believed this little pulse jet missile would force Britain to its knees. But what no one in Germany understood, not Lusser, not Dornberger, not even the scientists who had studied the fuse problem for years, was that somewhere across the ocean, American minds had already begun rewriting the rules of the battlefield. And for now, that secret was buried in silence. Through those early summer days, Germany fired thousands of V-2. Families slept in subway tunnels. Children learned to recognize the sound of the drone before they learned multiplication. Soldiers coming home on leave stepped off their trains into shattered platforms. And still, despite everything, the British spirit held. But courage alone could not stop a weapon like this. Something had to change, something big, and soon the change began, but quietly, almost invisibly. At first, the numbers shifted only slightly. Crews were hitting more targets, not many, but enough to make commanders notice. Then the rate climbed again, and again. By late June, Allied guns were shooting down 60% of incoming V-2. German analysts scoffed. Better radar, they said. Lucky shots. But by mid-July, the truth began to dawn like a distant storm. 70% shot down, then 74, then 79. On one extraordinary day in late August, 82% of all V-2 launched toward Britain were destroyed before reaching the city. Gunners suddenly seemed to have impossible accuracy. Shells were detonating not on impact, but perfectly 20, 50, even 100 feet from the target. It was as if every British gun had grown a mind of its own. German observers saw the bombs erupting mid-air, saw the fiery debris splash down into the Channel, and filed reports that made no sense. They quadruple-checked their missiles. They inspected guidance systems. They recalculated flight paths. Everything worked. Everything should have worked. And yet their unstoppable weapon was being brought down by the dozens. What the Germans didn't know, what even most British gunners didn't know, was that they were being helped by something almost miraculous. Something American. Something that should not have existed, according to the best German scientists. Something hidden inside the nose of every shell, waiting for the exact moment to change the course of the war. In those months, before the secret was revealed, all that Londoners knew was this. The drones were fewer, the explosions more distant, the nights a little quieter. And in those quiet nights, when families could finally breathe again, when anti-aircraft crews could look at one another with renewed hope, no one yet understood that this shift was not luck, nor miracle, nor chance. It was the first whisper of a revolution carried not by soldiers or ships, but by a tiny piece of American engineering no bigger than a man's hand, a fuse that could think. It had not yet been revealed to the world, but its shadow was already rewriting history. If the story of Britain's survival in the summer of 1944 began with fear, then the story of America's response began with something else, entirely an idea so bold, so unlikely, that the greatest scientific minds of Germany had already dismissed it as fantasy. And yet, in a quiet laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, far from the falling bombs and burning cities of Europe, a handful of American scientists were about to attempt the impossible. The Germans believed the physics made it hopeless. They had tested the theories, built the prototypes, run the experiments. Every attempt had ended in shattered tubes, broken circuits, and failure. 20,000 times the force of gravity, 20,000 Gs, was enough to crush even the strongest radio components. The spin of an artillery shell, 25,000 revolutions per minute, tore fragile wiring apart like dry leaves in a storm. No technology of the 1,930 seconds could survive that. Every German engineer agreed. A proximity fuse could not be built. It wasn't just hard, it violated the limits of what they believed possible. But in the United States, a country built on the stubborn belief that limits exist to be challenged, the question wasn't, can it be done? The question was, how do we do it anyway? Dr. Merle Tuve led the hunt for the answer. He wasn't a general, wasn't a battlefield commander. He was a quiet, intense physicist with the kind of mind that never stopped turning. And under the direction of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, he was given the rarest gift in wartime science: freedom. No budget ceiling, no rigid hierarchy, no fear of failure. Just one mission: solve what the enemy believed unsolvable. Across the country, the call went out: Western Electric, Raytheon, Sylvania, General Electric. The institutions and industries of America answered like soldiers reporting for duty. University scholars worked beside factory machinists. Young engineers shared tables with veterans of the radio age. Women from small towns stepped into assembly lines, building components they were told were for the war effort, never knowing they were shaping one of the most important inventions of the century. And together, patiently, relentlessly, they began creating a weapon that would transform the battlefield. The first challenge was the vacuum tube. Ordinary tubes shattered instantly under artillery acceleration, so the team turned to an unlikely place for inspiration: hearing aids. Those miniature tubes, the smallest and toughest in production, became the starting point. They were redesigned from the inside out, reinforced with wax, plastic, rubber cushions, anything to keep the delicate filaments from turning to dust inside a cannon. Then came the battery. Traditional batteries couldn't survive storage, shock, or firing. So Section T designed something the world had never seen: a tiny glass vial filled with electrolyte, sealed inside a dry cell. When the shell fired, the shock shattered the glass. The chemicals mixed. The battery woke up. The fuse came alive as it soared through the sky. Piece by piece, the impossible began to take shape. There was no single breakthrough moment, no dramatic shout of "Eureka!" across the laboratory. Instead, it was thousands of little victories: a wire that didn't snap, a tube that didn't crack, a circuit that stayed stable just 1 millisecond longer than before. Science advanced step by humble step, until one day, a fuse slammed through 20,000 Gs, spun like a drill bit, and came out the other side still humming with radio waves. The impossible had become possible. But genius alone wasn't enough to win a war. It needed to be built by the millions. And that was where America's quiet strength, its vast industrial engine, revealed itself. By 1944, over 100 factories across the United States were producing proximity fuse components. Imagine walking into a Crosley Corporation plant in Cincinnati, where refrigerators once rolled off the lines, and finding 10,000 workers, most of them women, many of them working their first industrial job building precision electronics with the steadiness of surgeons. They soldered tiny wires thinner than a hair. They sealed miniature tubes with perfect accuracy. They assembled and tested components by the millions. Not one of them knew the true purpose of what they were making. Not one of them knew they were shaping the future of warfare. Security was absolute. The fuse was code-named VT, variable time, to hide its true nature. Documents were locked in safes. Workers were given only their slice of the process. Even generals were told only what they needed to know. And still, somehow, through all the secrecy and complexity and urgency, the system worked. It worked because people believed in the goal, even without fully understanding it. Because Americans, engineers, machinists, factory mothers, university students believed that every small task mattered, and they were right. Every wire soldered, every tiny tube assembled, every battery sealed was a vote against tyranny, a quiet act of defiance. As the months passed, VT fuses began flowing to the front lines, first to the Allied warships of the Pacific, then to the anti-aircraft guns of Britain. Before long, a weapon no larger than a man's thumb was reshaping battles, oceans, and continents away. The Germans had abandoned the concept because they believed it could not be done. America proved it could because millions of hands refused to stop trying. And somewhere in a laboratory in Maryland, Dr. Tuve and his team watched the first combat reports come in. Enemy aircraft that once took 2,500 shells to bring down were now falling after just 100. Pilots who once flew unchallenged now found themselves shredded by explosions that seemed to know exactly where they were. The fuse worked, and it worked beyond anyone's expectations. But the greatest test lay ahead, for while the proximity fuse had begun saving British lives in the sky, its full potential, its true, world-changing impact was still waiting beyond the horizon, ready to reveal itself in a moment of crisis that no one yet saw coming. A moment when Europe trembled, when Allied lines buckled, when winter fell heavy over the Ardennes forest. A moment that would determine the future of the war. And when that moment came, the fuse would not just be a weapon, it would be a lifeline. By the middle of 1944, British gunners were no longer firing blindly into the sky. Their shells were no longer bursting far behind or far ahead of those screaming V-1s second. Instead, their artillery was striking with a strange, almost supernatural accuracy, exploding at just the right moment, as if guided by an invisible hand. And in Berlin, that precision was causing a kind of panic that no bomb, no invasion, no Allied breakthrough had ever triggered. Because to the German High Command, the numbers did not make sense. They were impossible. On paper, the V-1 should have been nearly unstoppable. German engineers had studied the British defences, their radar limitations, their manual fuse-setting procedures, and concluded with absolute certainty that even a well-trained crew could not reliably intercept a missile travelling 400 miles per hour. Everything about the V-1, its speed, path, altitude, and even its simplicity, had been optimized to slip past Allied guns like a ghost. And for 2 terrifying weeks in June 1944, it had. London was being pounded relentlessly. Buildings collapsed in columns of smoke. Children clung to their mothers inside subway tunnels, wondering when the buzzing would stop. German commanders celebrated. The calculations had been right. The V-1 was working. But then, like a tide turning without warning, the pattern shifted. At first by inches, then by miles. In late June, Allied guns were shooting down 60% of incoming missiles, far above what Germany thought possible. Then 74%, then 79%, then 82%. On one astonishing day in August, nearly every bomb launched toward Britain was intercepted. Hundreds of German observers stationed along the French and Belgian coasts wrote the same thing in their reports. The bombs are being destroyed too easily. Shells were bursting dozens of feet away, yet still throwing V-1s second out of the sky. Anti-aircraft crews were firing fewer rounds, yet achieving more kills. Some reports even described V-1s second exploding with no shell impact visible at all, just sudden, mid-air fireballs. What the Germans were witnessing felt less like improved British gunnery and more like magic. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, the mood turned from confusion to suspicion. Engineers were dispatched to inspect the missiles. Dozens of test launches were performed. Airfields were checked for sabotage. Components were remeasured with micrometers. Every propellant tank was tested for contamination. Every gyro was inspected. Every weld was examined. But the V-1, the pride of Germany's vengeance arsenal, was flawless. Nothing was wrong with the weapon. Something was terribly right about the enemy. That realization chilled even the most confident officers. General Max Wachtel, commander of the V-1 campaign, watched the collapse of his offensive with disbelief. He had believed in the V-1. He had seen its early success. And now he was watching a miracle weapon die before his eyes. Desperate for answers, he ordered further investigations, night launches to confuse radar, high-altitude launches to reduce predictability, low-level tree-skimming flights to hide the V-2 beneath British radar coverage. He launched in mass volleys, hoping to overwhelm the defences. Nothing worked. It was as if the British had built an invisible shield across the channel, one that reacted instantly to every single threat. And so, without proof, without understanding, without even a clue, Wachtel and his staff reached the only conclusion they could. The Allies possessed a weapon that should not exist. A weapon so advanced that Germany's brightest engineers had written it off years earlier. A fuse that could sense a target. A fuse that could choose when to detonate. A fuse the Germans believed was physically impossible. What made this revelation even more bitter was the fact that Germany had tried. Before the war, their scientists had explored proximity fuses too. They had experimented, theorized, machined prototypes, tested them, and failed. Each failure strengthened their belief that the idea was fantasy. German war doctrine, born of hierarchy and rigid structure, left no room for chasing impossible solutions. So when the Allies began using a working proximity fuse, the shock wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical, a direct blow to German scientific confidence. In bunkers, laboratories, and briefing rooms, German officers whispered about what they were seeing. They had no fuse fragments, no captured examples, no technical proof. But they knew. They could see it in the sky every day, V-2 bursting far before any shell could have physically struck them. It felt like sorcery. It felt like betrayal by physics itself. And then came the moment that would haunt German intelligence officers for the rest of their lives. December 16th, 1944, the launch of Hitler's final major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. German armored divisions smashed through American lines. Chaos swept through the Ardennes. Entire U.S. supply depots fell into German hands, including one ammunition dump containing more than 20,000 American shells equipped with the new VT Fuses. And the Germans did not examine them. They did not dismantle them, did not test them, did not suspect that the impossible technology they had been searching for, praying for, was sitting in crates right in front of them. They marked the shells as standard Allied ammunition and moved on. Why? Because their own scientists had told them such a fuse could not exist. And once a man believes something is impossible, he stops looking for it even when it lies at his feet. That single moment of intellectual blindness would cost Germany thousands of lives in the weeks to come. Back in Berlin, as the V-1 offensive collapsed, panic turned to dread. The Luftwaffe's leadership worried that the same mysterious fuse now tearing V-2 apart might soon be used against German aircraft. They worried the Allies would adapt the technology for field artillery. They worried, in quiet tones, that the war was already lost, and they simply had not admitted it yet. Every German commander who witnessed the V-1 campaign fail sensed that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just a new weapon. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one Germany was unprepared for. A war where shells didn't just fly, they thought. A war where industrial cooperation mattered more than a few isolated geniuses. A war where the side that could build the impossible, quickly and in secret, held the keys to victory. And as German officers stared across the channel at the flaming wrecks of their wonder weapons, one truth settled over them like a cold winter wind. The Allies had leapt ahead, years ahead, and Germany was no longer fighting an enemy of equal footing. They were fighting an idea, a philosophy, a system of innovation that no amount of determination or discipline could overcome. The V-1 campaign, once a symbol of German technological pride, had become the first great monument to their defeat. Not because the weapon was weak, but because America had created something stronger, and the world had only begun to see what it could do. The winter of 1944 came down like a hammer over the Ardennes. Snow drifted in thick sheets, muffling the world into a cold, white silence. American soldiers huddled in foxholes carved from frozen earth, their breath turning to mist in the air, their fingers numb as they clutched rifles that felt like blocks of ice. They were tired from months of fighting, tired from the relentless push across Europe, tired in their bones in a way only soldiers understand. Yet none of them were prepared for what came next. On December 16th, at 5:30 inches the morning, the quiet shattered. German artillery opened up with a fury not seen since 1940. Tanks rolled out of the forest like steel beasts awakened from hibernation. Entire divisions, panzer units, seasoned infantry, crack SS formations poured into the American lines under the cover of fog and snow. It was the beginning of Hitler's final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. American regiments were caught completely off guard. Communications collapsed, command posts vanished under sudden bombardment. Towns that had been peaceful just hours before were swallowed by the roar of engines and the iron tread of advancing armor. Many units fought until they were surrounded. Others were forced to retreat without even knowing where friendly lines were. And in the chaos of that surprise attack, a sprawling American ammunition depot fell intact into German hands. It was a treasure trove the Germans had never dreamed of, capturing artillery shells stacked to the ceiling, crates of ammunition as far as the eye could see. Among them were more than 20,000 shells equipped with the top-secret American proximity fuse. And just like before, just like during the V-1 campaign, the Germans didn't give those strange fuses a second thought. They examined some crates, made notes in their logs, and moved on. The fuses looked slightly odd compared to the clockwork designs they were used to, but not odd enough to spark suspicion. After all, their scientists had already declared such a device impossible. Why bother looking twice? Why waste time examining something that couldn't exist? So the miracle weapon remained untouched, unnoticed, ignored. And the irony, the tragic and almost poetic irony, is that Germany's greatest scientific minds were now marching blindly past the very device that would soon devastate their own troops. Back in Allied headquarters, panic erupted when news reached them that proximity fuses had been captured. American intelligence feared the worst, that Germany would reverse engineer the fuses, deploy countermeasures, or use the technology themselves. Teams scrambled. Emergency meetings were held. Engineers like Dr. Winfield Salisbury were ordered to rush counterjammer designs into production. Within 2 weeks, 200 specialized jammers had been installed in bombers flying over Europe, ready to protect Allied forces from a German proximity fuse that would never come. But the true turning point wasn't in the air. It was on the frozen ground of the Ardennes. For months, the Pentagon had forbidden the use of proximity fuses in land combat. The fear of a dud shell falling into German hands was too great. But now that the Germans had already captured thousands of fuses and done nothing with them, General Dwight Eisenhower made a decision that would change the course of the battle. He authorized their use, not just in anti-aircraft roles, but in field artillery. The moment the order reached the front lines, something profound shifted. Artillery, the backbone of American firepower, was transformed almost overnight. Traditional shells exploded on impact with the ground, meaning that soldiers hiding in trenches or behind cover often survived. A shell could land 10 feet away and kill no one if the angle was wrong, or if the terrain provided shelter. But proximity-fused shells didn't wait to hit the ground. They detonated in the air, above the target, raining shrapnel downward in a deadly cone. Trenches became traps. Foxholes became graves. Log bunkers, once thought nearly invincible, were shredded by steel fragments, slicing in from above. There was no hiding, no safe angle, no cover. And for the first time in the battle, American artillery spoke with an entirely new voice, the voice of inevitability. On December 18th, just 2 days after the German assault began, 200,000 proximity-fused shells were rushed to the front. Batteries that had been firing blindly now struck with supernatural accuracy. Entire German formations were stopped cold, pinned under explosions they could not outrun and could not predict. General George S. Patton saw the results with his own eyes. During one engagement near the Sauer River, a German battalion attempted to cross under the cover of fog and winter darkness. Patton's artillery opened fire with proximity-fused shells. When the smoke cleared, 702 German soldiers lay dead by actual count, as Patton later wrote. He sent a letter to the War Department that crackled with urgency and awe. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. When all armies get this shell, we will have to devise a new method of warfare. The Ren Spilus John Extreme. German soldiers soon learned to fear the strange American shells that exploded above their heads. Prisoners later described them as quick, powerful bursts, for which there was no defense. Some officers reported that men refused to leave their bunkers during American bombardments, terrified of the invisible killer waiting in the clouds. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The German assault, once so confident and forceful, slowed, then stalled, then buckled under the combined weight of American resistance and this new, merciless artillery. What had begun as a daring strike meant to split the Allied armies now turned into a grinding, desperate struggle for survival. The tide had turned. And the turning point had not been tanks or planes or infantry. It had been a fuse no larger than a man's hand, designed in a Maryland laboratory, built by American workers, shipped across the ocean in wooden crates, and ignored completely by the very army it was about to break. As snow continued to fall across the Ardennes, and as American soldiers slowly regained lost ground, the truth became clear. The proximity fuse wasn't just a new weapon. It was the moment when American ingenuity stepped onto the battlefield and spoke louder than any army could. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, and the smoke drifted away from the ruined cities of Europe, the war left behind questions deep, uncomfortable questions about how a nation like Germany, once so confident in its scientific brilliance and engineering superiority, had been outpaced so thoroughly by an idea born an ocean away. These questions hung thick in the air on May 10, 1945, when American officers sat across from Hermann Goering, the once mighty head of the Luftwaffe, now a captive in an Allied interrogation room. General Karl Spaatz leaned forward and asked a simple question, one that would expose an astonishing truth. "Have you any knowledge of a proximity fuse?" Goering paused, straightened his uniform, and replied with pride that Germany had in fact been working on such a fuse, and would have it ready in 3 or 4 months. 3 or 4 months. The war had been over for 2 days. The United States had been using proximity fuses for over 2 years. The American officers exchanged glances. Goering wasn't lying. He truly believed he was describing a near miracle of German innovation. He had no idea he was talking to the very men who had authorized the production of 22 million such devices. This moment revealed a crack in the German worldview wider than any crater on the battlefield. They believed in hierarchy. They believed in absolute certainty. They believed that if German scientists declared something impossible, it must be impossible. But the Americans had built the impossible. As more German scientists and officers were interrogated, the same pattern emerged. They had heard rumors of a strange American fuse. They had seen the effects in the Ardennes, in the skies over the Rhine, on the remains of destroyed bombers. Some suspected improvements in timing mechanisms or radar calculation, but none grasped the scale of what they were facing. It wasn't until Allied intelligence teams placed an actual proximity fuse in front of them, still intact, its tiny tubes and microscopic components nestled together like a mechanical miracle, that the truth hit with the force of a shell burst. Engineers who had once mocked the idea now stared silently at the device, turning it over in disbelief. One of them finally muttered words that summed up the entire German experience of the late war. This should not be possible. 20 toes. They weren't just astonished by the technology. They were astonished by the system behind it. An American system built on cooperation, shared knowledge, and industrial scale. They were confronting a philosophy that was completely foreign to them. Germany had relied on small groups of elite scientists, isolated from one another, guarded by secrecy, constrained by hierarchy. Every breakthrough was expected to come from a lone genius, a single spark. America had taken a different path altogether. Thousands of engineers, hundreds of factories, universities and companies working side by side. Women on assembly lines building components as crucial as any theory in a laboratory. The proximity fuse wasn't the product of one mind. It was the product of a nation that believed success came not from individual brilliance, but from collective effort. Germany never understood that until it was too late. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Before the proximity fuse, it took 2,500 shells to bring down a single aircraft. After the fuse, it took 100. Before the fuse, Bombs like the V-1 could tear through cities unchecked. After the fuse, 80% of them fell harmlessly into the sea. Before the fuse, infantry dug deep and survived artillery barrages. After the fuse, no trench could keep them safe. It was not just a new weapon, it was a new way of thinking. When German officers learned that the United States had produced 22 million proximity fuses, more than 2,000 for every V-1 Germany had ever launched, they were stunned. They simply could not imagine manufacturing something that delicate at that scale, while simultaneously fighting a global war. But that was exactly what America had done, and that was the real story of the fuse, not just its technical brilliance, but the system that built it. Dr. Vannevar Bush, the man who oversaw America's wartime research efforts, later said that the proximity fuse had 3 decisive impacts. It saved the U.S. Navy from kamikaze attacks in the Pacific, it saved London from the V-1 campaign, and it saved American infantry during the Battle of the Bulge. 3 theaters of war, 3 turning points, 1 device small enough to fit in a soldier's palm. But Bush added something deeper, something the Germans never fully understood. The proximity fuse mattered not only because of what it did, but because of what it proved. That democracy, with all its arguments and disagreements and chaotic energy, could innovate faster, collaborate deeper, and produce more effectively than dictatorship ever could. Germany had believed that rigid hierarchy made them strong. In the end, it made them blind. And perhaps no image captures that failure better than the one discovered in the Ardennes, a massive German ammunition depot filled with more than 20,000 American proximity fuses. The deadliest artillery innovation of the war sat inside wooden crates, unexamined, untouched, ignored. The German engineers walked right past them because they already knew such a device could not exist. They lost because they trusted their assumptions more than their eyes. They lost because their system crushed collaboration. They lost because, in the end, they could not imagine a world where ordinary people, factory workers, machinists, mothers, engineers could come together and build something extraordinary. When historians look back at the proximity fuse today, they often call it the second most important American weapon of the war, surpassed only by the atomic bomb. But unlike the atomic bomb, the proximity fuse didn't depend on a single moment or a single strike. It worked quietly, invisibly, relentlessly, saving lives day after day, battle after battle, coast after coast. And perhaps that's why it remains so unknown, overshadowed by flashier weapons. But its legacy surrounds us. Every smart bomb, every guided missile, every weapon that can sense and respond to its target. They all come from the same idea discovered in a small Maryland lab, built in American factories, fired from American guns. The fuse changed warfare forever. And long after German officers shook their heads in disbelief, long after scientists whispered, "Impossible," long after soldiers walked past crates they never understood, the message of the proximity fuse still echoes. Brilliance matters. But belief and the courage to try matters even more.